The Museum of Religious Freedom was imagined as an inclusive virtual space for archiving, learning, and critically reflecting on the complex histories and contemporary concerns relating to the freedom of religion or belief in Sri Lanka.
Thematic areas within the museum have been informed by the mapping of 70 events and incidents related to religious freedom and is a place for exploratory learning spanning from the colonial period to the present day.
We invite you to discover the virtual spaces made up of digitized artifacts and architectural elements, archival documents, audio-visual content, community conversations, and expert commentary focused on issues related to the freedom of religion or belief in Sri Lanka. Join us. Good evening, everyone. My name is Yamini and welcome to the second of a series.
அனைவருக்கும் மாலை வணக்கம். என்னுடைய பெயர் யாமினி. இந்த சேலமுருக்கு உங்களை அழைப்பதில் உங்களை சந்திப்பதை ஏற்றில் நாம் பெரும் மகிழ்ச்சி.
Very briefly introduced you to the museum, which is of course the basis for all our conversations. So in case you are new to Minor Matters is a national campaign to advance the freedom of religion or belief and promote religious harmony in Sri Lanka. We particularly work with youth, but also other key stakeholders to increase literacy on and promote social respect for religious freedom in the country. But before we go any further, we want to take a moment to thank you all for taking time to join us on a Sunday evening to be part of this conversation. Our aim is to make this an engaging and meaningful hour as possible. So, however, before we go into today's event, let me just briefly comment on what the Museum of Religious Freedom is all about. There is a good chance that all of us here agree that religious freedom has been a contentious topic in Sri Lanka. While the history concerning religious freedom has been fraught with complexity, the present too, as we all know, has had its fair share of concerns. So the Museum of Religious Freedom has been envisioned and developed as an inclusive trilingual space to archive, learn, and critically reflect on the complex histories and contemporary concerns relating to religious freedom in Sri Lanka. So also the space is digitally immersive, and we have used technology to amplify and bring to life history in a way that otherwise couldn't have been. And we are glad to say that the museum was a recipient of the Intercultural Innovation Award by the United Nations of Alliance of Civilization and the BMW Group in 2019. In case you're wondering why the museum is still under development, we will be giving you an opportunity to visit the space at the end of the webinar and have a sneak peek of sorts. Yeah. So for those joining us today, let me also very quickly give you an idea of our conversation last week. Last Sunday, we spoke about what went into building the Museum of Religious Freedom. And particularly, we spoke about the thinking behind the museum, its objectives, the research and curatorial thought that has shaped the museum, and of course, the design and development. So today, we will be exploring the relationship between religion and the colonial state and the factors underlying modern religious identity formation in British colonial Ceylon, which is actually the focus of the first cluster of the museum. So at this point, I'd like to introduce you to our moderator and panelist for today. So the conversation between the panelists will be moderated by Shamara Vettimuni, who is the lead researcher for the Museum of Religious Freedom. Shamara is a Bite Scholar in History at the University of Oxford. Her doctoral thesis is on identity formation and religious conflict in British colonial Sri Lanka. Before beginning her DPhil, she was the team leader of the politics research practice at Verity Research, where she focused on contemporary religious violence. She has a master's and bachelor's in international relations and history, both from the London School of Economics and Political Science. We also have with us today Ramla Wahab Salman, who is the Associate Director of the Programming at the American Institute for Lankan Studies in Colombo. And she leads the AILS team specializing in digitization and digital archiving of endangered historical material from Sri Lanka. Ramla is also a researcher in the field of urban history. She completed her BA in history at Lady Srindram College for Women in Delhi and her MA in history at the School of Oriental and African Studies, London. I'm pleased to also introduce you to Professor Harshana Rambuppala, who is the Director, Postgraduate Institute of English, Open University of Sri Lanka. Professor Rambuppala has held a fellowship at the University of Edinburgh and was the Sri Lankan chair at the South Asia Institute, University of Heidelberg. His book, The Politics and Poetics of Authenticity, A Cultural Genealogy of Sinhala Nationalism, was published by the UCL Press in 2018. Professor Rambuppala has published in areas ranging from socio-linguistic, literary, cultural studies to history in various journals, including the Journal of Asian Studies. Next, I'm also honored to introduce Professor Tamil Maran, who is an attorney at law and an academic. He's the former Dean of the Faculty of Law and head of the Department of Public and International Law in the University of Colombo. He has also served as a visiting scholar in various international schools. Professor Tamil Maran has specialized in constitutional law, human rights law, and has published multiple books and journals. He's currently writing a book on Sri Lanka's criminal law. So thank you to all of you for joining us today. And I'll hand it over to Shamara now. Shamara, over to you.
Thank you very much, Yamini, for that introduction. So I'm going to spend the next 3 minutes introducing the process of modern religious identity formation in the 19th century before handing over to our panelists who will move us through the British colonial period into the post-independence period. And through our discussions today, we're hoping to highlight how certain religious communities found themselves in conflict with other religious groups and what their responses to such tensions were. So our discussion today focuses specifically on the British colonial period. As Yamini mentioned, this is the period in which our virtual museum begins. However, and to quote Professor Rambuppala's recent book on the politics and poetics of authenticity, we're not suggesting that British rule from the 19th century onwards was a period that invented identities. There is, of course, a far longer history to religious identity formation, which cannot be understood without taking into account the impact of Portuguese and Dutch colonization, the independence of the Candian kingdom, and indeed the many centuries of Lankan history that preceded it. Now, historian John Rogers has convincingly argued that social classification during early British rule was used as a tool to establish a more centralized, unified, and self-consciously modern framework of government. In the establishment of the Ceylon Legislative Council in 1830, but in 1889, with the introduction of a seat for a Mohammedan member in the Legislative Council, religion also appeared to be a factor in the representation of population groups. For the British, Mohammedan was the term used to define followers of Islam. Similarly, with the introduction of decennial censuses, groups were encouraged to identify or were identified by their religious identity as well as their ethnic identity. So in one sense, there is an imposition of ordering of the local populations by the British by religion. But by no means did this mean that we were given our religious identities. Instead, at certain times, existing identities appear to come into sharper focus. And it's in this vein that I would like to pose the first question to Professor Tamil Maran, while giving a bit more background to our audience. The 19th century was one which saw a heightened period of religious revival, including Buddhist, Hindu, and Islamic revival. There were a number of factors underlying these religious revivals, but one such factor that was common across all three religious revivals was no doubt the presence of Christian missionaries proselytizing across the entire island for the first time. Now, in the Buddhist revival, a topic that we do explore in this virtual museum quite significantly, revival took the form of the Panadura debates between monks and Christian actors, the growth of Buddhist societies like the Young Men's Buddhist Association, the proliferation of newspapers like Sarasavi Sandarasa and Sinhala Bauddha, as well as the emergence of Sinhala Buddhist nationalist leaders such as Anagarika Dharmapal. Professor Tamil Maran, could you tell us a bit about how Tamil Hindus responded to the Christian missionary presence, particularly in the north, but also elsewhere in the island. For instance, can you tell us a bit about the Hindu revival, the impact of Arumuga Navalar, and the developments in Hindu education during the 19th century?
Tamara, now looking at this particular issue from a historical perspective, now the political agitation that we can actually identify with the Candian resistance, that is named...
Professor, can I just say that your video is off at the moment? I don't know whether you want to switch it on, but I just want to let you know that it's off.
Okay, right.
We can see you now. Thank you.
Yeah. The Candian resistance that was identified as a traditional one or conventional nationalism, because that was mostly based on certain political aspirations. Whereas in the early 20th century, what we have come to know as ideologically coherent nationalism, that was actually a phenomenon that continued even after the independence. So I would say post-independence era, where we have come to face the challenges of religious freedom. But what happened during the 19th century, there was this movement. In fact, the historians say that the British were not at all bothered about the political resistance coming from the Candian side, but they were more concerned about the middle path that was very much linked to the religious revival. Actually, the real challenge started to come from the middle path, resistant to the British rule, that is in the form of religious revival. So in that context, the missionaries actually played a big role in creating a particular class, right? It is not the top elite, but at a secondary level, creating, the missionaries were responsible in creating that secondary level resistance that was very much connected to the education. That was, in fact, it is a dilemma, of course. That was, they actually obtained that education from the missionaries themselves. For example, what they call it, the repatriation of education. Those who did not have the facilities to go to Britain and get education, that is the number one elite. As I told you, the British did not consider the threat coming from the upper level, the elite group. They did not take that very much seriously. But the resistance coming from the secondary level, those who actually got the benefit of education through the missionaries, and they posed the challenge in the form of religious revival. So I would draw a comparison in this respect. Now, say we talk about 1948, this Universal Declaration of Human Rights, where we say religious freedom and other rights and freedoms. Of course, we know that certain Western countries were very much keen in introducing that 1948 declaration based on the liberal political ideology, Western political ideology. But as a result of that, in other colonial territories, because of the result of the influence of the UDHR, these colonial territories started to agitate for their independence. So the UDHR played a big role in contributing towards the resistance against the colonial rule in parts of the Asian and African countries. A similar phenomenon that you can observe what happened in the I would say the second half of the 19th century, particularly in the northern province, or in the north, I would say. Now, historians also have recorded that the recovery of Hinduism in the 19th century predated that of Buddhism. For example, in the early 1840s, the revival of Hinduism started in the north before the first Buddhist school that was established in the south. Here comes the contribution made by Arumugan Navalar, a unique personality. And also it is commented as that the influence, because Arumugan Navalar was involved or working together with the missionaries for more than a decade. So he had learned the skills, of course, from the missionaries on two areas or two matters, I would say. One is propagating, how to propagate the religion. For the second part, there's the education. In both areas, the skills that, because he was associated with the missionaries for a longer period, and it was also stated that he helped the missionaries to translate Bible into Tamil also. Maybe that part of experience made this person or molded this person in a different form, and he used education and also the preaching style the missionaries adopted. So he actually adopted both techniques from the missionaries, and towards that he went on to establish first the school, the first Saiva school in Jaffna town. Then second, he established the press. I told you the propaganda he actually learned from the missionary, then he adopted the same method. So for that purpose, he established his own press. So now you can see the education through these both channels, I would say, through the schools as well as the press. So the same way the missionaries conducted their religious activities, that is printing handbills and pamphlets, distributing them in certain areas, and also by conducting regular preaching sessions in an open air system. Both these were actually, I told you, that adapted from the missionary. So he, of course, succeeded in that, and also the materials that he prepared and published through his own press. Again, the missionaries' methods were adopted, right? In a simple language, explaining the religious precepts, principles, etc., and thereby attracted a crowd. As a result of that,
මෙහි ප්‍රතිඵලයක් විදිහට ඔහු යාපනයේ ඇති කරපු පළමුවැනි සයිව පාසල කළමනාකරණය කරන්නට කළමනාකරණ මණ්ඩලයකට පැවරලා තිබුණා. ඒ කළමනාකාරීත්වය යට
Hindu schools were established right in the Jaffna, and that was a real challenge posed to the British rulers. So now education, the triangle that I would identify, the triangle is education, religion, nationalism. And the upper level elite, I told you that they got the benefit of the English education. The real challenge to the British rule did not come from that upper level elite. The real political challenge came from the second level of elite, who got the benefit of English education. And they got it actually because of the missionaries. But once they have become very fluent, right, in English language and exposed to the Western European educational system, they use the same, right, their knowledge, experience to pose a political challenge, but in the form of religious revival. So that is why nationalism and religion now it has become inseparable, right? At this point of time, we say, because now you can see the interesting phenomenon here. The upper level elite, the first level elite, when they return after obtaining education from Europe, they were forced to change their ideology. They were forced to change their religious belief because of the pressure coming from the secondary level. Because the real political challenge came from the secondary level, but they got the benefit of English education because of the missionaries. In the north, I told you the first school was established. The government encouraged, I would say encouraged, that the government schools, whether some schools were known as English schools or superior schools, but there was an understanding between the government at that time, colonial state, government and the missionaries. Wherever you have the missionaries established schools, you had to close down the English schools established by the government that was at that time managed by the Department of Public Instruction, something like that.
Okay.
So there was an understanding, the proximity, that if there is a missionary school, you should not establish a central school close to that missionary school. That was the idea. Because of that, Armand actually succeeded, right? To pose a challenge to those missionary schools by establishing this 150 Hindu schools that later on helped. So my point is this nationalism and this religious revival has become or had become inseparable because the real political challenge to the British rule came from the secondary one in the form of religious revival. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Thamamaran. And actually what you said about the use of the printing press as a technique borrowed from the missionaries is very interesting, because it's not unique just to the Hindu revivalists, but it was used by Sinhala revivalists and later on by Muslim revivalists as well. And actually that's what I want to ask Ramla about next, actually. Could you tell us a bit about the origins of the Muslim press, which I know followed the Buddhist and the Hindu press? Who were the key figures behind the Ceylon Moor or Malay press? And also, were women represented in these publications?
Hi, Shamara. Can you see my presentation?
Yes, we can. Yeah.
Okay. So thank you very much, Shamara, Yamini, and the team at Minor Matters and NCESL. I'm very glad to be here. My presentation today is a bit of a mix of research and practical experiences from digitization efforts. So the first question is really, what is Muslim, right? And what is a Muslim press? I mean, that speaks to Shamara's opening comments of the writings of Dr. John Rogers as well about religious identity, ethnicity, race, and what being Muslim really was. And in my understanding, in the printing press, being Muslim was it was a conscious choice. And this is, I mean, it was only 1949 in newly independent Ceylon that D.S. Senanayaka replaced Moor with Muslim in the electoral register. So that's, I mean, one example we can take to sort of understand the complexities in sort of dealing with these identities. Yeah. So my second slide deals with two newspapers. The first is Alamat Lankapuri, which was established by B.O. Saldin, who is also known as the first person who established the printing, the lithographic printing press in Sri Lanka. And Hello. Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, Ramla.
Oh, I'm sorry. Something happened with my screen share.
But your screen has, your screen has stopped sharing.
Yeah. Is that okay now?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. It was in 1869 to 1870. And I mean, historians like Professor Ronit Rishi have spoken about how professors like Alama Tankapuri at that point were read by a lot of pilgrims who visited ports in Colombo, and also they had a wider circulation. But then comes the story of Muslim nation in 1882, which is a little more complicated. The Muslim nation was established by MC Siddhi Lebde, who was also a member of the Kandy Municipal Council. And he was an interesting figure in that he was the first person actually to print a rebuttal to the Ponnambalam Ramanathan's Ethnology of the Moors of Ceylon in 1888. And this was before the famous rebuttal by ILM Abdulaziz about a decade later. And the Muslim nation also worked to increase awareness, education, and literary production among men, women, and youth. And to me, it was quite interesting that the newspaper carried a weekly column on a fictional love story between a British lady and a Colombo Moorman. So, I mean, that was quite interesting to understand really where Siddhi Lebde was coming from in a community that was perceived as quite closed and quite rigid in their ways. And also, I mean, going back to the point of the ethnology of the Moors in Ceylon, it was really the lobbying of Siddhi Lebde and others that pushed MC Abdur Rahman to actually get a seat in the Legislative Council in 1889. I now go on to, yeah, can you see my slide?
Yeah, but you could make it full screen maybe, if that's possible.
Yeah, sure, yeah. Sorry, I'm having some issues. Okay, so this leads to my third slide, which is the Star of Islam, which was actually a digitization project carried out between the Sri Lanka Malay Association, the American Institute for Lankan Studies, where I work, and the South Asia Open Archive, which is a body that brings together South Asian materials, which is based in USA. So, I mean, my team and I were in an extremely privileged position to actually work with the custodian of a set of newspapers, which was the Star of Islam, and we were able to digitize 43 volumes of this newspaper from from July 1939 to 14th September 1940. Now, this is a very interesting moment in global history because on the 2nd of September, the Star of Islam carried an article sort of reasserting Malay identity in a very strong way to say that Malays and Muslims are ready to stake everything in defense of the empire in World War II. Now, the 2nd of September is very interesting because it was a day after Nazi Germany under Adolf Hitler invaded Poland. And I mean, there are several instances where these identities sort of come through really strongly. And I mean, in understanding the need of a press at home rather than international development, I mean, there is a series of columns that is written by Justice, the famous Justice Akbar, after whom Justice Akbar Mawat is named in Slave Island, which goes into the issues of Muslim representation within the services and imperial services, and the willful suppression of Muslims in India and Ceylon. And he also quotes the Premier of Bengal at that period, Fazlul Haq, in saying that Ceylon should use the example of the Congress in India in sort of understanding the power of a press. And he says that, I mean, the Congress is able to sort of throw dust in the eyes of the most astute politicians. And this is something we could sort of employ in Ceylon.
this brings me to my final point, really, which is finances and the press. So, I mean, in sort of using these identities, Moor, Malay, Ceylonese, Muslim, Islam, the selection of titles is extremely interesting. And I mean, it also begs the question, was the idea of going global really a choice to maintain readership and subscriptions for pressers? Because what is common across Muslim pressers throughout the period is that they were sort of dying down within an year or so because of issues of finance. That kind of brings together a lot of questions of these networks, whether the choice of it was political, the choice of these titles was political, does it establish a stronger reader base through these networks of Muslims across South and Southeast Asia, or was it just a mix of all these factors? And I mean, Shamara, you were also interested in the question of gender and women in the period. And I mean, on my screen, you would see the case of Princess Esma, who was a well-known princess in the Muslim world, and she was sort of a celebrity subscriber, so to say, of the newspaper. And she was a scholar of 6 languages, and she's sort of a figure that's spoken about through the press. But I mean, apart from her also, there were women writers, and women were active in debates on science, religious philosophy, and there was a lot of debates about the role of ladies' unions within the city of Colombo. So this leads me to my final slide, which is the practical side to a digitization project. So these are just some images from the project the American Institute conducted with the Sri Lanka Malay Association. So you would see, I mean, we begin with what condition we find these documents in. I mean, I was quite surprised when the custodian of these extremely valuable archival resource sort of pulled it out of a briefcase from his car boot and said, yeah, well, this is my family archive. And then it sort of led to the process of assessing the material and finding out whether if it was too fragile to even be scanned, and then moving on to the scanning and repair stage. And the final sort of stage was to hand over the restored volumes to the custodians of the archive and sign over the digital copyrights to the online archive. And I mean, through this process, we learned that the best practice to do this is to return the most likely damaged material, which one would find in a better condition that you found it, by using expert techniques and also disseminating this material like, well, I'm doing right now. So thank you for your attention. I'll stop sharing my screen now.
Thank you so much, Ramla. And I mean, just learning about the digitization process is also so useful, particularly for a project like ours, because there's a lot of conservation work that's going on through this. And as you know, and as I know, certain of these Muslim newspapers in the National Archives are crumbling at the moment. And that's why digitization and shifting it into an online space is particularly important before it's too late. So thank you very much, Ramla. And I think maybe since you ended with the Star of Islam, which was published in about the 30s, it's time to kind of move into the post-independence period. And so for my last question, Professor Harshana, can you tell us how the colonial state interacted with religion in the post-independence period, and how the state came to be officially associated with Buddhism in successive constitutions in the 70s?
Okay, thank you, Shamara. I hope you can hear me clearly. How much time can I use? 15 minutes? Is that okay?
10 minutes, okay, we can stretch it to about 12.
No, I just wanted to clarify, okay. All right,
okay.
And thank you to Minor Matters for inviting me for this to talk on at the event of this very important initiative. Before I respond substantively to your question, I just want to say a little bit about maybe the overall context in which we are doing this. Now, the history, the museum of freedom or religious belief is a conscious intervention in Sri Lanka at this point of time, when we are still struggling as a community to articulate a kind of a multicultural, multi-religious view idea of the nation, right? So like no act of history is innocent, nor is the museum innocent in that sense. I mean, there is some sort of agenda behind that. So in doing that, I think we need to think very critically about the period that we are talking about, the period that we covered just now, say the late 19th to early 20th century period. And I think when we use terms like nation, nationalism in that period, we need to have some degree of caution, because these ideas still had not become very broad-based and very clearly defined. What whatever this nation was going to be was very much in negotiation. And I think the two speakers who spoke before me, in the content of their analysis or what they said, that was clear. There was a lot of kind of movement around, and then things were not very clarified. So for instance, when we use terms like Sinhala Buddhist, even though there was a newspaper that was published which was called Sinhala Bauddha, Sinhala and Buddhism, the Sinhala identity and Buddhism were not as clearly connected as they are in the post-independence period. So, and if you read somebody like K.N. Dharmadasa and the rise of linguistic nationalism in the early 20th century, you realize that Sinhala nationalism was much more of a linguistic phenomenon at that point. And many, so others in the Sinhala community, non-Buddhists, Christians, others were very much plugged into that discourse. And that also operated under this sort of overall idea of a Ceylonese kind of nationalism as well, at least at the elite level, even though it may not have percolated down below that. So I think it's important that we keep this frame in mind when we talk about this. Now, I think the other speakers covered, sort of kind of the connection that the colonial state had with religion. I'll say very briefly something about Buddhism. So to a large extent, from what I know of this history, the colonial government's major focus was on resource extraction, the economy, and governance. It was in some ways blind to religion in that official sense. It was not really blind, because in many ways the missionary agenda was also present, but not as official state policy, but because of the level of influence Christian missionaries had within the colonial state, right? So it is in this context that you have to then understand things like the so-called Buddhist revival. And there again, I think recent scholarship has highlighted a need to move away from an understanding where we see the Buddhist revivalist movement simply as a reactionary movement against missionary activity or the colonial state. Buddhist revival had other focuses as well. So for instance, if you read Anne Blackburn's work and the life and career of Hikkaduwe Sri Sumangala, one of the sort of greatest scholar monks of that period, you realize that there was engagement on other multiple fronts, like issues of caste in the Sangha order, or issues of property and control over property in the Sangha, and then issues of ordination. And also the Buddhist imagination was not just confined to Sri Lanka, the island. It extended beyond to Myanmar and other parts, what some scholars call the Buddhist cosmopolis. So I think in that sense, our understanding of Buddhism also needs to go beyond that of the nation state, that beyond the frame of the nation state, because Buddhism was not simply being fashioned in response to Christian missionary activity or to the presence of colonialism. And similarly, with the much sort of critiqued, maligned, as well as much celebrated Anagarika Dharmapala. Dharmapala was also very much an internationalist and a regionalist at a certain level. But though we tend to understand him as a nationalist today, right? So I think it's very important that we keep this in view as we talk about this period. Now, I mean, I've been asked to cover a fairly large kind of area, and this transition is kind of very difficult to cover in this short period of time. But I think it would be right to say that to a great extent, the relationship between Buddhist culture, right, and Buddhist society and Christian culture was conflictual, and that in that period, and it was conflictual because of the way the Buddhist revivalist movement was shaped by Christian missionary activity and the necessity to respond to it. Now, like I said, that's not the only focus, but that was a very dominant influence, right? And into this mix came things like the 1815 Candian Convention, which I think you all profile in the museum as well, because the convention was seen as a moment where the colonial state undertakes a certain kind of responsibility towards the Buddhist religion and for the protection and propagation of Buddhism in the country. But then the colonial state largely fails in fulfilling that pledge. It doesn't really happen because Buddhist education, temple governance, all of these things go into a kind of crisis. And there, I think, I mean, what Ramla covered and what Professor Tamil Maran also spoke about, Arumuga Navala, the need to build a modern education system in a way to counter the Christian missionary activity that emerges in the Buddhist revivalist movement. Then the use of newspapers for dissemination and sort of modern mass communication, right? Okay, so in a way, there's a conflictual history, but what we have to remember is that right up to even the 1940s, Sinhala nationalism was not Sinhala Buddhist nationalism. It was very much Sinhala nationalism in a broader sense, and it could therefore integrate Sinhala Christians within its fold as well. Even if you read somebody like Anagarika Dharmapala, there are many moments where he brings in the Christians. For instance, there is this text by him called An Address to the Young Men of Ceylon, where Christians are also included in certain ways, but there is a kind of exclusion as well. So it was not very clear cut. It's in the 1950s, and I guess we can mark 1956 as a very critical moment in this juncture and the coming to power of the MEP, the Mahajana Eksat Peramuna, under SWRD Bandaranaike's leadership, as a turning point in terms of a kind of an institutional, more public political role for Buddhist activism. And this is not just the Sangha, but sort of lay Buddhist activists also becoming playing a much more active political role in the country. And 1956 also coincided with the Buddha Jayanti, or the 2,500 years since the passing of the Buddha. And there's this sort of Buddhist millennialism that comes in that period. And in 56, there is also a report, the famous Buddhist Commission report that is authored, which builds a narrative of sort of colonial victimization of Buddhists and Sinhalese. And there 1815 figures as a very important trope, as a very important idea, and a kind of a betrayal, right? And the notion of the betrayal of Buddhism comes very strongly in that report as well. And in a way, that kind of sets the tone for Sinhala and Buddhist in the post-independence period to a large extent. And we see this even today in a very strong sense, that Buddhism and Sinhala society were hurt through colonialism more than any other community. I mean, this is how the Sinhalese and Buddhists see it. But I think if you stood from a more neutral perspective and looked at the history, every single community probably suffered almost similarly under colonialism. It's very difficult to kind of extract one community and say that they were targeted more. But this is the narrative that has become really dominant in Sri Lanka today and continues today. And it is so powerful that even leftist political activity in a way accedes to this. And here I think the critical sort of historical marker is the 1972 Republican Constitution, and how a special clause on Buddhism is added to that in a process that was led by Colvin R. De Silva, who was very much a secular leftist, a man from the old left who didn't have any public or sort of religious affiliation. But that shows how even the left, to a great extent, capitulated to a kind of a Buddhist and Sinhala nationalist dynamic, and kind of abandons the more ecumenical, class-based, inclusive kind of politics that a leftist political movement would be expected to follow. I think I will stop with that. Basically, what you see is in the post-independence period an increasing politicization of Buddhism, and of course by now we see the Sangha has evolved several more steps to direct political intervention. So I will stop with that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Harshana. I should have said this earlier, but please do enter any questions you have in the chat box. But we're also, and I'm really sorry I didn't say this earlier, because we're actually now opening up for question and answers from the audience. You can either leave your questions in the chat and I can read it out and direct it to the relevant panelist, or you can just, I think you can you raise your hand on this? Yes, you can also raise your hand on the instructions below and ask your question directly. So yes, we will spend the next 10 minutes, 10-15 minutes doing Q&A. I will just use my privilege as moderator to ask Professor Thamilmaran a question while perhaps the rest of you formulate your questions. Professor Thamilmaran, is there any evidence of conflict, violent conflict between Hindus and Buddhists in the pre-independence period? Because we hear a lot about, for instance, you know, the Sinhala Muslim pogrom, the anti-Moor pogrom of 1915, known as the Sinhala Muslim riots. And we hear, of course, of, you know, Buddhist Catholic conflict in the Kotahena riots. I was wondering, is there any evidence that you've come across of Buddhist Hindu conflict?
Independence era, that means during the colonial rule, there was no, as far as I know, there was no serious conflict between the Hindus and Buddhists. And of course, everyone knows that what happened in 1915 when there was a conflict between Buddhists and Muslims. That is the intervention by Sir P. Ramanathan. Actually, he went to London, spoke to the Secretary of State for colonial states and mediated. So it clearly shows that there was no direct or serious conflict between the Buddhists and Hindus, because as I have observed earlier, that there was an understanding about the resistance to the colonial rule in the form of religious revival. So whether it comes from the Buddhist or whether it comes from the Hindus, the revival, in a sense, the resistance to the activities of the missionaries, that would actually pave way for the so that may be, I would say, it is not a direct or negotiated understanding between the two sides, but we can see that there was a harmony, focusing on I would say a common target, right? The of independence, working towards that. Early 20th century, I would say, there was some understanding that they have to work together. So in that context, there was no direct conflict between the Buddhists and the Hindus. And also looking at from another perspective, I would say, even there were some irritations I think both sides did not want to highlight it or bring it out right openly, because there was a for both groups there was this common goal that they had to achieve. The political. So there was a compromise. I would say that we had to work together, and the contribution by each side was very well recognized by the other side. So that may be one of the reasons why there was no direct conflict between the Buddhists and the Hindus at that time, pre-independence era.
Okay, thanks, Professor Tamil Maran. As I mentioned, any questions, please feel free to raise your hand or type it in the chat box. On the topic of Ramanathan, as you mentioned, he was immensely helpful to the Sinhalese in the aftermath of 1915 and went to London, as you said. But as Ramla mentioned, he was a fairly controversial character as far as the Ceylon Moors were concerned in the 1880s, with certain papers he wrote and speeches he wrote. Ramla, would you be able to tell us a little bit about what that debate was? Because you also mentioned it in your talk earlier.
Yes, well, it was, Shamara, a question of representation, right? And he argued in an essay which was, I believe, first submitted to a legal commission, and in 1888 published in the Royal Asiatic Society, that basically Muslims were an extension of the Tamil community. So, I mean, their representation could be covered by a Tamil seat. And there was a major objection to this, which immediately came by Siddi Lebbe, who was also, interestingly, a member of the Royal Asiatic Society at that point. So it was a direct debate. And if I could also just add something here, if we have a little bit of time, the editor of the Star of Islam, who passed away at the young age of 35, was actually connected to this debate of representation, was also lobbying for a Malay seat under the Donamo Times, right? So in the 1920s, he actually led a delegation to the Donamo Commission to argue for a separate Malay seat, that the Malays could not be subsumed in the Moor category, because they were, I have the number here, they were a population of, I believe, 150,000 or something. Let me get that. Yeah, they were 15,000 Malays in the island, whereas the Moors were 231,000, making it impossible for a Malay candidate to have a voice in a combined electorate, which is quite similar to what the Moors were also arguing for, right? So, and he also sort of, in these contentions between race and religion, he argued that although the faith of Islam is shared, they were by race Malay, and they had their own mosques, customs, practices, and identities in the island, which were very different to the Moors, unlike some Malay communities in other parts of the world, like South Africa, which is sort of subsumed into a larger sort of identity. So it was a sort of interesting parallel there in understanding, I suppose, minorities within minorities and defining minorities in the colonial state.
Thanks, Ramla. There's a comment in the chat from Dr. John Rogers, and he says, this is not a question, but a brief comment on Shamara's question on religious violence between Hindus and other groups. As Professor Tamil Maran says, there was no Buddhist-Hindu violence, but there were various small incidents of Hindu-Catholic conflict, which normally also reflected caste differences. And I suppose this comment also speaks to what Professor Harshana said about the fact that caste differences, featured in the Buddhist revival in the early period as well. So caste is something that, we haven't addressed in this talk as much today, but was definitely a live issue. There's a question from Suren Lad to the panelists. Were there any initiatives to promote interreligious activities in the pre-independence era? And we can just open it out to any of the panelists if you would like to say anything.
Yeah, as far as I know, no report is available for interreligious initiatives before the independence. The reasons may be that there was a common ground on which actually both groups agree to work together. That is one. Second, since there was no direct violence or any antagonism, right, against each group, each other, I don't know whether they felt that there should be some initiatives at the time. That may be one of the reasons for not recorded or historically recorded any initiatives to promote these religious activities, because the conflict based on religion between the two groups, that was not a real threat to the existence of each one, right? Whether the Buddhist group or the Hindus, they did not see the existence of the other groups is a real threat to the existence of themselves. It was not seen in that sense. So that may be one of the reasons why there was no such initiative, and there was a common ground that they had to work on it. They would have focused on that aspect. The common ground, what I say, is independence came actually in the form of religious revival, but the resistance to the missionaries, that is the common ground for both. They had to come on. So therefore, the focus was on that, resisting the missionary activities and the political resistance to the colonial rule. Since the focus was on that, I don't see any recorded incident of such, right, or historically any initiatives, activities.
Thanks. And I think Ramla also wanted to add to that.
Yes, I mean, I agree with Professor Tamil Maran there that, I mean, resistance was sort of the common ground there, missionary activity and political resistance. But an example I came across from my research in the urban planning sphere was that planners were in fact promoting city-based interreligious activity, like for instance, to keep Colombo city clean. And that was a model adopted from Jerusalem, which was sort of brought in, and there were some activities by the state to sort of bring together religious communities to keep their spaces clean. So, I mean, it wasn't religious peace activism per se, but it was interreligious activity. And I found that an extremely interesting example of sort of space in these contexts.
Shamara, may I say something briefly? Yeah, so I think the idea of sort of interreligious work or interfaith work probably predates that, postdates that period. It was probably not a kind of a idea that existed at that time. As I'm no expert, but this is what I guess. But as Ramla mentioned, there were certain spaces where people from different religions, different communities could sort of connect together. One, for instance, was all this sort of this revivalist spirit was very broad. So there is, for instance, in the 1920s and slightly earlier, there was a movement to revive Ayurveda and indigenous medicine, and that brought together a broad spectrum of people. Ananda Kumaraswamy was involved, there were Muslims involved, Moors involved, there were Sinhalese involved. So it did not break along the lines of religion or ethnicity or race or anything. There was a certain kind of ownership of Sri Lanka's past which cut across all identities, and that changes, though by the 1940s, 50s, you see a process by which all these other people start dropping out. And in the up to the 50s, there was something actually, the Sri Lanka Progressive Writers Association. This was based on the Indian Progressive Writers Association, which was a very leftist. The Indian Progressive Writers Association played a very strong role in Indian nationalism as well. a very broad-based leftist movement of bringing progressive writers together. So early 50s, there's evidence that people like Martin Wickramasinghe and Gunadasa Amarasekara were present in this. But by the mid 50s, they have gone. And there is, I think, Selvi Tiruchandran has written about this. There was one incident in Kandy where at a meeting of this group, a Buddhist monk and some Sinhala writers had got up and questioned the presence of Tamils in there. And so by the 50s, you can see things changing quite dramatically. But prior to that, there was a lot of space for collaboration. So, yeah.
Thanks, Professor Harshan. And actually, if you don't mind, can I direct the question in the Q&A from Ashley Ferdinands to you? It asks, would it be correct to say that copying the Christian missionary propaganda methods helped the revival and development of Hinduism, Buddhism, and nationalism in Sri Lanka?
Yes, certainly. I mean, I think Professor Gananath Obesekara's entire thesis of Protestant Buddhism, and he uses the term Protestant in two meanings. One is, so Buddhist revival, he argues, emerged as a protest against Christian missionary activity and Christianity, but also adapted certain practices of Protestant Christianity, like the use of the press, like certain forms of even sort of evangelical sort of activity to promote Buddhist activity. But now subsequent scholarship, and even if you go back to somebody like Kitsiri Malalgoda, who wrote sort of the most definitive work on the Buddhist revival, that's what I mentioned. Buddhist revival was not simply a reactive thing. It had already gathered pace earlier. So there was a modernization process that was happening. So it was not simply responding to the Christian missionaries, because I think when we look at it like that, we are also denying the agency of the people who were behind this, as if they were just responding to some threat. No, there was other things happening, but largely this comment is right. I mean, yeah, they did adapt a lot of these practices.
May I add something to that?
Sure.
What was Archana said?
Yes.
Now they said that Armugan Navalar was associated, right, with the missionaries for more than a decade. And he learned the technique from the missionaries. Now, say like the Sunday, right, sermon or prayer in what the missionaries conducted, he made it a point that every Friday there would be a public forum in the Jaffna town where he explained the Hindu religion. In fact, he adopted a particular Saivis thing. That is why the criticism made against Armugan Navalar, because where he emphasized the existence of the caste system among the Hindus, he actually went by the scriptures, right? Accordingly, he maintained that caste system. That is one of the criticism made against his. That is quite true. That unfortunately, considering the caliber of his personality and all, it was very much justified in making the criticism. What he conducted was not a social reform. It's just purely a religious revival. So he actually did not consider the existence of caste system among the Hindus and how it would actually damage his future activities, or recognizing him as a social reformer. He did not bother about that. He focused on the religious revival. Why I said that he adopted this propaganda system from the missionary, that actually the missionaries were very much stronger in Jaffna than any other parts of the island at that time. Missionaries were much stronger. The activities and the schools run by them very, very efficiently they were run actually. And it was very much stronger. So that is why he had to counter it through education, English education. In 1872, I think the Hindu board that was established, and later the small school that was later to become as the Jaffna Hindu College, what we have today, providing English education. That was the real focus that he wanted to have at the time. to resist the missionary. The activities were much stronger. It was felt, right? The damage caused by the missionaries were much stronger there. Therefore, it should be with the equal rigor that should be resisted. So he adopted the same method. And at that time, at the Friday meetings, he used to distribute these small pamphlets. That meant for the rural folk, the ordinary people, the person on the street, you can easily read and understand. So that is exactly, I would say, copied from the method the missionaries were using at the time.
Thank you very much, Professor Thamilmaran. And we've now gone 5 minutes over, so I'm really sorry that we've eaten further into your Sunday than promised. But I'll hand over to Yamini at this time to wrap up.
Thank you, Shamara. And okay, so once again, thank you to all our panelists as well. I'm afraid we've reached the end of the webinar, like Shamara mentioned. And I just want to take a few minutes to appreciate and thank a few people who have been behind this work. Firstly, a special thank you to Godfrey Yogaraja, our CEO, who has been behind us and offered us unstinted support, and the Minor Matters team, comprising Akshina Palihavadana, Shalami Daniel, Shenal Jesudian, Navindu Mendis, and Richel Marsale, and of course, many others too. Apart from that, we also want to thank a panel of experts who took time to go through the material and make some very valuable suggestions. So thank you to them as well. And I think Professor Harshana and both Professor Thamilmaran are both here who actually were part of the panel of experts as well. And also a special thank you to our curator for the Museum of Religious Freedom, Dr. Vindhya Butpitia. So we also want to thank the UNDP, European Union, and the CKU in Denmark for their support, without which all of this wouldn't be possible. Well, like I mentioned earlier, this webinar is organized as a series of events, which will continue throughout the month of October. So next week, we will talk about how to remember or memorialize violence. And finally, we will cap off things on how we legislate on religion. So stay tuned for more information on these interesting conversations, all based on the Museum of Religious Freedom. So in the beginning, as I told you, we will have a sneak peek to the museum. So I think we have sent the link on the chat box below. So feel free to visit the space, bearing in mind that we are still working on it, improving it, and including introducing language functionalities in Sinhala and Tamil and other optimizations as well. So bear with us as you navigate the space. And if you have any thoughts, please write to us. The email is also on the chat box, and the link will function till 12 p.m. tomorrow. So thank you very much, everyone. And it was great having you join us. And from all of us at Minor Matters, good night and see you soon.
Thank you and good night.
The Museum of Religious Freedom was imagined as an inclusive virtual space for archiving, learning, and critically reflecting on the complex histories and contemporary concerns relating to the freedom of religion or belief in Sri Lanka.
Thematic areas within the museum have been informed by the mapping of 70 events and incidents related to religious freedom, and is a place for exploratory learning spanning from the colonial period to the present day.
We invite you to discover the virtual spaces made up of digitized artifacts and architectural elements, archival documents, audio-visual content, community conversations, and expert commentary focused on issues related to the freedom of religion or belief in Sri Lanka. Join us.